In this lecture video, we'll be looking at Marx's critique of the liberal theory of freedom. We're going to see what exactly liberalism has gotten right, but also what are its limitations. What are its limitations concerning what Marx calls its conception of political emancipation, as opposed to what he calls human emancipation or universal emancipation or freedom. I'll be focusing on two texts of Marx's, first on the Jewish question, and secondly, the 1844 economic and philosophic manuscripts. Before I get into those texts, we need just a basic outline of the liberal account of freedom, what, again, Marx calls political emancipation or freedom. And basically, liberalism is the political philosophy that says government is legitimate to the extent it protects rights. This is perhaps most famously argued in John Locke's second essay, where he talks about the three natural rights being life, liberty, and property. There are different accounts of, to what extent is property a right? Is it instead fraternity or the pursuit of happiness? There are different accounts of what these rights are. This is just one example. But I should also say, in terms of that definition of liberalism as the political philosophy that says government is legitimate to the extent it protects rights, this comes in different forms. To what extent then should government be more limited? It is definitely, liberalism originates based on what is later Judah Sklar calls the liberalism of fear of, powerful government that violates the liberties of individuals. But at the same time, then government, depending on the conception of rights, is also there to provide a kind of framework for the ability for each to pursue their own conception of the good. So then what role does the government have, for example, in education and so on? So these are all debated within liberalism. But more or less, the conception is the purpose of government is the protection of rights, and to the extent that it does that, that government then is legitimate. The liberal conception of freedom then consists in what we can call civil equality, civil liberty, and civil democracy. So, liberty basically is just understood as kind of the absence of external impediments, or you also have the conception of freedom as non-domination, basically the ability to not have one's will influenced or coerced by others. Then you have equality, which is really meant as like equality, politically speaking, right? Such that you have one person, one vote. You don't have what are called second-class citizens, meaning some have more rights than others. And then you also have the political conception of democracy, which is that, all citizens are to be basically co-determinants of the will of the government, right? And so this typically is understood as voting, and whether this means voting directly or voting for representatives that then, pass legislation and debate on the behalf of the citizens, that also is debated within liberalism. And what Marx is going to say is that, this is progress. Definitely, you need this kind of political freedom. It's an improvement upon feudalism, where you don't have this. But it's not the whole story. And that's the problem with liberalism. That liberal rights are really to be understood as just mere formal rights, not concrete rights. And there's a difference, because for Marx, liberalism is basically going to think about freedom in terms of the state and the relation of the citizen to the state, but not freedom in terms of the person in civil society, how they relate to other human beings and to humanity as a whole. Now, before I get to Marx's critique of liberal theory of freedom as seen in his essay on the Jewish question, I need to give some context. So firstly, the Jewish question was basically this idea really prominent in the 19th century, especially in continental Europe and Germany, about, from different perspectives. So from Jews themselves, the question of liberation, how can Jews, not simply be second-class citizens in, for example, Prussia, which was a religious Christian state. So you have the Jewish question, which is a question of emancipation from the Jewish perspective. And then you, of course, have the Jewish question as something that is more anti-Semitic, which is, what do we do with all the Jews in Europe? How can, what can we do when they seem to, not really, be outsiders and, questionable as to where their allegiances lie and things like that. So it's kind of double-sided. And what's going on in this essay is Marx is going to be critiquing Bruno Bauer and his argument as to how to resolve the Jewish question from the side of the question of Jewish emancipation. What would Jewish emancipation or Jewish freedom consist in? What is required? Interestingly, Bruno Bauer was actually Marx's dissertation advisor. Now, there is definitely anti-Semitism, and I'll get to that in a moment, within Bruno Bauer's argument here. And Bruno Bauer basically being what was called a young Hegelian, or kind of like a leftist Hegelian, he basically argued that Jews and everyone else can achieve political emancipation only by relinquishing their particular religious consciousness, since political emancipation requires a secular state. And this really comes from the idea of liberalism being based upon the idea of freedom of conscience. So this idea of, there should be no state government, or there should be no state religion, such that all citizens are free to practice the religion they want. And Bruno Bauer basically ends up arguing, well, the only way that, Jews can be free is if there's a secular state, and Jews then relinquish their religion, and they stop being Jewish, basically. So that's definitely anti-Semitic. But Marx, a lot of his, especially his early writings, they are criticisms of his contemporaries, of, various anarchists, liberal thinkers, Hegelian thinkers, and so on. And so you kind of have to sift through the various essays that he writes kind of just as criticisms of all the different people at the time and what they get wrong, to kind of piece out, like, well, what is his critique on liberalism? And so that's why we find then in his essay on the Jewish question, his critique of liberalism as brought about by his critique of Bruno Bauer. So what Marx argues, as in contrast to Bruno Bauer, is that the move beyond question of religious freedom to the question of human emancipation is the goal. So this idea of framing emancipation or freedom in terms of, whether there's a secular state and to what extent you have the correct religious belief, that is thinking about the question of emancipation wrongly, because it's not thinking about emancipation universally. It's just another version of what Marx is going to say, a formal conception of freedom, but not comprehensive or concrete or universal freedom. For Marx, mere spiritual and political freedom maintains economic unfreedom. That definitely, yes, right? And he even mentions this in the United States. He says, look, in the United States, there is more or less a secular state. But yet you still have the private practice of freedom. So in this case, Bruno Bauer is wrong because you have a secular state, and yet people are still extremely religious in the United States. And so yes, that's good, right? That you can have this freedom of conscience in a political sense, where the state isn't going to tell you what to believe or fine you or put you in jail or whatever for believing the wrong thing. But that isn't quite what freedom consists in. The real desire is comprehensive or universal freedom, not simply freedom in one or more domains of life, which in the case of Bruno Bauer and Marx thinks liberalism more generally, they think of freedom as consisting in the political sphere. And the civil sphere is just something different that is left up to the individuals and however individuals choose to relate to one another. So I also, before we get into the critique, want to just take a moment to mention whether or not there is anti-Semitism from Marx in the essay on the Jewish question. Undoubtedly there are Jewish tropes that Marx will mention as when he refers to like Jews as money worshippers and things like that. But it is important to distinguish his argument from the use of Jewish tropes and anti-Semitic, I should say, tropes and things like that. Because Marx is arguing for universal emancipation, of which then includes Jewish emancipation, such that Jews also deserve and should have freedom in the same way that everyone else should have freedom as well. So he is not making an anti-Semitic argument such that, well, Jews can't have freedom because like they're undeserving or I don't know, different from other Europeans or whatever, right? Like whatever the different anti-Semitic arguments would be. That's not what Marx is arguing. I mean, Marx was actually ethnically Jewish, although he was raised in a Christian household, probably as a result of anti-Semitism in Germany. So, he definitely was not Jewish. He wasn't religious at all. This is a debate among scholars as well. To what extent, then, can we say on the Jewish question is anti-Semitic or whatever? So I'm not trying to say whether it is or isn't anti-Semitic, just that his argument is about universal emancipation, universal freedom, which includes freedom for Jews as well. So I just want to make that clear because there's a lot of... the text can be difficult, and at times he's like quoting Bruno Bauer or re-articulating what Bruno Bauer argues, and Bruno Bauer will make anti-Semitic arguments, but Marx isn't exactly making those arguments. He's trying to say this is what Bruno Bauer says, and the text is kind of dense and hard to understand if you don't know the arguments at the time. So I just want to lay all that out there. What we're going to focus on is the first part, which is his critique of the liberal conception of freedom as merely political, as well as his connection to an account of religion and its relation to the idea of emancipation. The second part of the essay is his critique of Bauer's theological analysis of Judaism and religion. And this is especially where the anti-Semitic tropes will be found. But it's important to try to understand, although we're not focusing on it, what Marx is doing in that second part is he's countering Bauer's theological analysis of the idea of Jewish freedom with a materialist or naturalist analysis, because Marx is considered one of the fathers of the discipline of sociology. So he's trying to basically give like a sociological account of religion and where this idea of religious freedom comes from and so on. But we're going to focus on the first part. So liberalism abolishes political classes, right? It says, look, there, the distinction between and the relation between a lord and a serf, unjust, right? There should be no political classes such that you have the ruling class and then the lower class established by birth. So hereditary, right to rule, unjustified. The idea that you would have political classes established by social rank, whether you're a knight or a peasant and so on, unjustified. That it would be established by education or occupation, all of that would be unjustified, right? Who gets to rule, who has a say in the will of the government is determined by the people collectively. So when they abolish the influence, Marx focuses, of course, on private property, as he is the foremost critic of capitalism. He says that when liberalism politically abolishes private property, in the sense that to the extent that, one owns private property doesn't mean you ought to be able to vote, or if you don't own private property, not vote, or if you own private property, then you ought to be able to rule, and if you don't own private property, you shouldn't be able to rule, right? Liberalism says that kind of a system is illegitimate, right? That private property shall not be a prerequisite for voting or seeking office. And so it would seem like, look, liberalism is saying private property shouldn't determine the rights of citizens. But Marx says something interesting in response to this idea. He says, far from abolishing these effective differences, the political abolition of private property, only exists so far as they are presupposed. As the abolition of political class established by birth, social rank, education, and occupation, they are actually presupposed. They're only abolished in a political sense, but socially, they remain. He says, it is conscious of being a political state, and it manifests its universality only in opposition to these elements. That to say that there is political freedom from a political class established by birth, education, and occupation is to say that, well, in civil life, there will be these things, classes established by birth, social rank, education, and occupation, but just not in government. All the presuppositions of this egoistic life continue to exist in civil society outside the political sphere as qualities of civil life. They still remain. They don't remain in government, but they remain in our social civil life. This, for Marx, means that humans live a double existence. On the one hand, we have a political life, we are citizens. On the other hand, we have a civil or social life. And where we think of ourselves as being free, Marx says, right, which goes with our political life, that's really freedom in the abstract. Because it's freedom to say, look, you can vote over, what kind of laws there should be and so on. But in most of the time that you actually exist and in the way in which you're concretely related to others, those classes remain. And even, to this day, by proponents of, philosophical liberalism, they still talk about a middle class. They seem to acknowledge, there are still classes, not political classes, right? But they'll say a middle class, which of course implies an upper class and a lower class, although they never say upper class, lower class. So presupposed in the political conception of freedom is that there will still be classes established by birth, social rank, education, and occupation, only in the social and economic spheres of life, just not in the political sphere. So here we're going to focus in on the conception of liberty. So liberalism says that liberty is the power which man has to do everything which does not harm the rights of others, right? It's a freedom from external coercion. Again, while that is something great, right? You don't want to say, that's ridiculous, like, that's the wrong conception of liberty. Marx is saying it's an incomplete conception of liberty. That mere political liberty is actually simply the right to isolation from humanity. Not simply isolation from other individuals, but isolation from humanity itself. What Marx calls a species being. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So he says, the limits within which each individual can act without harming others are determined by law, just as the boundary between two fields is marked by a stake. It is a question of the liberty of man regarded as an isolated monad, withdrawn into himself. So here he's basically saying, look, the way that liberty is talked about, the way in which the law determines the separation of property, that's actually the way the law and this mere political conception of liberty treats human beings, as kind of like property to be distinguished from one another, as objects. He says, but liberty as a right of man is not founded upon relations between man and man, but rather upon the separation of man from man. It is the right of such separation, the right of the circumscribed individual withdrawn into himself. It leads every man to see in other men not the realization, but rather the limitation of his own liberty. That what actually makes possible society is how we relate to one another. It is the social relations. And instead, the idea of mere political liberty, freedom from external coercion, characterizes the relation of human beings as being antagonistic, as saying, look, when you want to pursue your life goals, the only thing that's stopping you is other human beings, as opposed to what makes possible your pursuit of your life goals is the way that humans relate to one another in a society, providing the foundation for you to achieve your goals. He says the practical application of the right of liberty is the right of private property in civil society. That the way that private property is talked about, that is effectively what political liberty is. That when you talk about what does it mean to be truly free, it is effectively the freedom to own private property and to treat yourself as property. It is not the freedom as a human being, but it is instead rendering yourself as property to be distinguished from others, to have rights in the same way that private property would have rights. And he also says that in terms of the right to equality, what does that actually mean if you have mere political freedom? It has no significance. He says it is only the equal right to liberty as defined above, namely that every man is equally regarded as a self-sufficient monad. That, yes, right, the right to equality is to say you shouldn't have more rights than anyone else. But what kind of rights do you have? You have the right to think of yourself as a piece of property, to be protected from others, and to try to increase the value of yourself as property, to be sold and how you network with others. But it is not an equality in the sense of equality as in human being and human universal emancipation, as we'll see a little bit later. What about democracy? How could Marx critique democracy? Well, he actually doesn't critique the idea of democracy. He critiques the limitations of mere political democracy. If we think of political democracy as the self-determination of the political citizen, Marx wants to instead ask, are workers empowered to determine the conditions in which they spend most of their awake hours? Yes, they have the right to vote for their representatives and who will determine law upon which they then are obligated to obey. But what about where they spend most of their lives, which is in civil society and especially at work? Marx is influenced by the ideals of the French Revolution, by the ideals of life, liberty, and fraternity. But when Marx is living in the emergence of industrial capitalism, he looks around and he's seeing, okay, you have the bourgeoisie, those who own private property, the bosses, the capital class. You have them who live lives of luxury, those who have the time to pursue their own intellectual flourishing, to seek an education if they want it, to better themselves in whatever the way they desire because they have the material means. And he says, well, what kind of rights does the worker have? And he's looking at the time in the 19th century where most people, they have to work 12, 14, 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. And for what? Oh, well, the right to determine who their elected representative is. Does that elected representative do anything to address, where they spend most of their life in civil society? And Marx concludes, no, the working class, while they might have political democratic rights, they might have self-determination politically, they don't have self-determination socially or economically. Instead, in capitalism, the worker is alienated in 4 different ways. They are alienated from the product of their labor, that which they produce. They are alienated from their own labor as a worker. They are alienated from their species being, and they are alienated from other human beings. So firstly, workers are alienated from the product they produce, in the basic sense that, what they are to produce isn't determined by themselves, and what is to be done with the product and its profit isn't to be determined by themselves either. All of those things are determined by the boss. They go to work because they have to go to work, right? If they don't go to work in a capitalist society, they starve. You either become an owner of private property that employs workers, or you are a worker. So in order to survive, you effectively have to give up the self-determination of what you want to produce. Now, some people, of course, might say, well, look at, how life is now in the 21st century. People can try to choose what kind of line of work they want to go into, whether that be fashion, teaching, the service industry, right? Whatever else, it seems like you kind of get to choose. And Marx would have two responses to that. The first would be, okay, you get to choose, but do you get to choose whether you have to sell your labor, whether you have to work for someone else? And secondly, he would say, okay, but what about the basic social relation of the fact that you still, in that occupation, don't get to determine what you produce, because it is ultimately, if you're going to accept the job, up to the boss. And what is done with the profit is up to the boss. This is an imminent contradiction of Locke's labor theory of private property, right? Because Locke says, well, you have a right to private property if you mix your labor with that object and increase its value. And here Marx is looking at all the workers, and he's seeing, well, through their labor, they're making the thing more valuable. And yet they have no say over what they're to produce, what is done with it, and when it is sold, where that excess value that their labor enabled, where it goes. Yeah, they get a small piece of the pie, but the vast majority of that value is not determined by themselves. He says, the product of labor is labor which has been embodied in an object, which has become material. It is the objectification of labor. Labor's realization is its objectification. So questions to ask, I think, are, does his account of alienation from the product of labor still hold for tech work and the service industry? So I'll just leave those for you to think about. Secondly, alienation of labor from worker. Marx thinks that labor is not merely something physical. It's not like, well, labor is thought of as, plowing the fields, building things, but it's also mental labor, planning. In capitalism, who does the planning? Well, we've already seen that what is produced isn't determined by the worker, and how it is produced isn't determined by the worker. So in that sense, in capitalism, the worker has their mental labor divorced from themselves. They are reduced to kind of a mere cog, where the boss hires you and says, you're going to fit in here in this production process. You are reduced to mere manual labor. In this way, the labor of the worker is self-alienating. That labor is not your own. That labor, of which when Locke talks about the rights of private property, yourself as property that you own, it is now owned by the boss. Labor is external to the worker. Labor is coerced. And again, right, the liberal conception of political freedom would say, well, the government isn't telling you have to work. Marx says, yeah, but there's social coercion. Because if you don't want to work in a capitalist society, you starve. Unless, again, you become part of the capitalist class. If you are part of the capitalist class, though, the only way you can make profit is to hire workers. So it actually depends on the relationship of owner to worker. And finally, the external character of labor appears as foreign then, since it is owned by another. And that is kind of what Marx is getting at. That your concrete life, your concrete existence, appears as something foreign, as something alienated, estranged from yourself. Because you don't have the right to self-determination in the economic and social spheres of life. So let me read here what he says. What then constitutes the alienation of labor? First, the fact that labor is external to the worker, i.e., it does not belong to his essential being. That in his work, therefore, he does not affirm himself, but denies himself. He does not feel content, but unhappy, does not develop freely his physical and mental energy, but mortifies his body and ruins his mind. The worker, therefore, only feels himself outside his work, and in his work feels outside himself. He is at home when he is not working, and when he is working, he is not at home. His labor is therefore not voluntary, but coerced. It is forced labor. It is therefore not the satisfaction of a need. It is merely a means to satisfy needs external to it. Its alien character emerges clearly in the fact that as soon as no physical or other compulsion exists, labor is shunned like the plague. And here he means capitalist labor. He thinks that as human beings, we want to work. We want to be creative. We want to see our endeavors realized. And we like working, but we like working for ourselves. So when he says labor is shunned like the plague when it is not coerced, he means the capitalist form of labor. And think about that, right? Who actually wants to go and work at Dairy Queen or whatever else, Lastly, the external character of labor for the worker appears in the fact that it is not his own, but someone else's, that it does not belong to him, that in it he belongs not to himself, but to another, and specifically, not to the boss, but to the capitalist class. He belongs to another class. As a result, therefore, man, the worker, no longer feels himself to be freely active in any but his animal functions, eating, drinking, procreating, or at most in his dwelling and in dressing up. And in his human functions, he no longer feels himself to be anything but an animal. What is animal becomes human, and what is human becomes animal. Thirdly, the worker is alienated from their species being. So species being is a Feuerbachian concept that Marx seems to endorse. And basically we can understand the idea of a species being as a universal and free being by the fact that they are part of a species, and that species being humanity. That to understand you are a species is for your self-consciousness to be identified as a member of the human species and not merely as an individual. To be a member of something greater, which has the capacity to realize, its most extreme intellectual endeavors. That the intellect is a kind of matter of the species, the intellect of the species, and not merely the individual. That humanity only lives and acts authentically, Marx thinks, when they live and act deliberately as a species being, i.e., as a social being. He thinks we are social creatures. The problem is that because capitalism alienates our labor from ourselves and alienates the object of our labor, well, because mental and manual labor is part of what it means to be a human being, that we can determine and think about what it is that we want to do with ourselves and what we want to produce. When capitalism alienates that from ourselves, capitalism alienates ourselves as a social being, rendering us as kind of cogs or as monads. And we no longer think as a member of the human species, but we think of ourselves as withdrawn, isolated from others, where others then are only impediments to our real wants and desires. So from alienating the worker from one, nature, and two, their self, the life of the species, not merely for each individual as a worker, but for humanity as a whole, it turns into a life of an individual, such that alienated labor alienates the species of humanity, because we no longer see what are the great pursuits of humanity, the arts, the sciences, these kinds of higher intellectual endeavors. And instead it's a matter of, looking at the short term, right? Think about the stock market. It's always about short-term gains. In a business, you're always thinking about the next quarter. As a worker, you're always thinking about needing to have enough money to pay rent for the next month. And you no longer think long-term. So, Marx says, life itself then appears only as a means to life. In other words, you basically live to work as opposed to working to live. And he says, similarly, in degrading spontaneous activity, which would be free activity, to a means, estranged labor makes man's species life a means to his physical existence. The last form of alienation is alienation from others. That because we're alienated from our species being and we become withdrawn into ourselves, that each worker then encounters the value of other workers only by the position in which they find themselves as a worker. And as a worker, your means of subsistence is precarious. It is not guaranteed. Every worker then becomes understood as an active or potential competitor to your own livelihood. Or because what Marx argues about political liberty in its actual practical application, meaning that we become treated as kind of property, as objects, well, we start to relate to others as property, as private property, as commodity-like beings to be used as a means to grow capital. Think about this with the idea of social networking. What is that? Well, it's trying to figure out, well, who has certain kinds of connections so I can kind of use them so I can further my own self. And you start to think of yourself as capital to be grown. I mean, in many ways, we talk about social capital. Grow your social capital. We no longer think of treating each other as kinds of ends in themselves, but rather as a means to our own end. And capitalism, by alienating ourselves from our species being, starts to treat our own ends as nothing other than either as a worker, the desire for mere subsistence and focusing on the short term, making sure you have enough money to survive, or as a capitalist, focusing on the growth of profit itself as an end in itself. And then capitalist society as a whole, that's what its kind of raison d'etre becomes, the pursuit of profit at all costs. So who then does free labor belong to? Well, Marx says it belongs to humanity by the fact that you are a human being. And what it means to be a human being is to be able to plan and execute your own ideas. But in capitalism, who does free labor belong to? It doesn't belong to the worker. That is alienated from the worker. Instead, it belongs to the capitalist as a class. The question, what is the foundation then of private property? It is alienated labor, which you might think, well, it seems like alienated labor is a result of private property. But notice what Marx has been arguing is that you only have the existence of private property in capitalism if you have a species which no longer sees itself as related to each individual, but as separate monads, right, to be used for our own gain. That enables the conception of private property. Although he thinks later on in capitalism, once it develops, they become reciprocal. That then alienated labor reinforces the grounds upon which private property can exist, and that's reciprocated, vice versa. Lastly, I just want to mention this. It's very important to understand. Why would an increase in wages to better compensate the worker not solve the problem? Because Marx does not argue, well, the solution then is higher wages for the workers or even equal wages, that everybody should have the same income. He's not arguing this. And the reason is because it doesn't matter how high the wage is or if you have an equality of wages, the social relation between the owner and the worker remains the same. And that is a relation which is undemocratic because the worker does not have self-determination in the economic and social spheres of their existence. So we should understand political emancipation, the liberal conception of freedom, as being a great progress, as Marx says. But he says it is not indeed the final form of human emancipation, but it is the final form of human emancipation within the framework of the prevailing social order. It is the final form of the conception of freedom within capitalism and within the emphasis on the state as being the grounds for our existence. But he says it goes without saying that we are speaking here of real, practical emancipation. What would this consist in? Well, political emancipation, he says, is a reduction of man, on the one hand, to a member of civil society, an independent and egoistic individual, and on the other hand, to a citizen, a moral person, such that then, when we are, on the other hand, reduced to a citizen, a moral person, we start to moralize. We start to see the problems in society as our own fault. Are you poor? Well, that's your own fault. You didn't work hard enough. As opposed to seeing it as a systemic issue, an issue that results from the way in which social and economic life is created. Human emancipation, then, will only be complete, he says, when the real individual man has absorbed into himself the abstract citizen. When, as individual man, in his everyday life, in his work, and in his relationships, he has become a species being. And when he has recognized and organized his powers as social powers, so that he no longer separates this social power from himself as political power. So real, concrete, human, and universal freedom will only be realized when democracy, when democratic self-determination is extended beyond the mere political sphere of existence to also include the social and economic spheres of human existence.